In our headlines at this hour, President Yoon is heading to Madrid on this Monday to attend the upcoming NATO summit. He's also scheduled to host a trilateral meeting with his US and Japanese counterparts on the sidelines of the security summit. The leaders of the group of 7 countries are in Germany addressing a host of global challenges, ranging from Russia's atrocities against Ukraine to climate change and the cost of living crisis. Here in South Korea, much to public dismay, authorities are poised to raise electricity bills amid escalating oil prices worldwide. Hope your work week is off to a good start. You're watching the Daily Report for Monday afternoon, June 27th, here in capital Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. President Yoon is heading to Madrid on this Monday to partake in the 2-day NATO summit, which begins on June 29th. That would be this coming Wednesday. Now, Mr. Yoon is also scheduled to sit down with his US and Japanese counterparts on the sidelines of the Security Alliance summit. Our Kim Hyo-sun starts us off.
The leaders of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan will sit down for a trilateral summit on Wednesday in Spain on the sidelines of a NATO summit. No such trilateral summit has taken place for the past 5 years or so amid strained ties between Seoul and Tokyo. Yet relations between the two Asian neighbors have shown signs of improvement since Yoon took office as South Korea's president, pledging to improve ties with Japan. While there was speculation that Yoon could hold a one-on-one meeting with his Japanese counterpart in Spain, no such meeting, whether in the form of an official summit or a pool-aside meeting, is likely to take place. During the scheduled trilateral summit, the 3 countries are expected to discuss an array of issues, including the security situation on the Korean peninsula. There are a total of 14 diplomatic functions scheduled for Yoon in Madrid, including the NATO summit, during which he will underscore the importance of the denuclearization of North Korea. While Seoul is not a member of the military alliance, it has been invited as a partner along with other countries such as Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Yoon is also expected to hold a series of bilateral meetings with leaders from Canada, Poland, the Netherlands, and Denmark to discuss ways to expand economic cooperation. First Lady Kim Gun-hee plans to accompany Yoon on his first overseas visit. She plans to attend sessions for the leaders' spouses and other events, including a guided tour of the royal palace, as well as a dinner with Korean residents in Spain. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Over in Germany, members of the Group of 7 have kicked off their summit this past Sunday, touching upon a wide range of global challenges, including Russia's war in Ukraine and its broader repercussions on global oil and food prices. Also, leaders have agreed to expand sanctions against Kremlin with a ban on Russian gold. Now, later on Monday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is scheduled to address the summit virtually. Meanwhile, G7 leaders have also pledged to raise $600 billion to support infrastructure in developing countries and counter China's Belt and Road project. Also on the international front, for the first time in a century, Russia has defaulted on its foreign currency sovereign debt. According to Bloomberg, Monday, Russia has failed to make an interest payment of $100 million by the deadline, which was this past Sunday. The initial due date had been May 27th, but the payment was delayed once with a grace period of 30 days. Now, Russia, for its part, has reportedly denied the default, claiming it is capable of covering the debt, but that Western sanctions were hampering the payment. Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine has prompted Western nations to freeze Russian assets through sanctions and remove Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system. In other news, the South Korean won's recent weakening in value against the US dollar is spelling trouble for Korean nationals living overseas. Our Yoon explains.
The South Korean won has been weakening against the US dollar, not only as the world recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic, but due to increased external economic risks, noticeably the prolonged war in Ukraine, a global energy crunch, and the US Federal Reserve's policy rate hikes. It's not just people here in South Korea that are suffering from the hard-hit currency exchange rate. This is Ms. Kim, who's been running a Korean guest house in Interlaken, Switzerland for 10 years. She's weathered through the global pandemic, but now, just ahead of the peak summer traveling season, the shocking exchange rate has left her with 0 reservations. She's agonizing over maybe having to close her business.
COVID-19 travel restrictions have been improving, so I was hoping for travelers. But now gas prices are spiking, currency rates are worsening. If this continues, I might have to shut down.
Global crises have already raised living expenses around the world, but the weakened exchange rate only makes livelihoods difficult for other Korean residents living overseas. Among them is Mr. Park, who's been studying in Shanghai, China for 9 years. He has had to make drastic cuts to his living expenses.
I'm studying abroad, so I live on the allowance my parents send. The exchange rate leaves me with less money to spend.
The exchange rate is outrageous. My allowance of 1 million won used to be around $900, but that has now dropped to around $700. I've had to move to afford rent.
With many Korean international students studying abroad, the situation is just as bad for parents paying tuition fees. The average tuition for a 4-year university course in the United States is around 50 million won. Now, the exchange rate has added at least another 5 million won. Parents have no choice but to further divide payment installments while they wait for the exchange rate to improve.
We've seen more parents ask about paying tuition in installments and whether they can use credit card payments rather than bank wire transfers.
This is the first time in almost 13 years since the financial crisis of 2009 that the exchange rate has weakened to 1,300 won to the US dollar. Current circumstances and signs of major economic risks are expected to remain for the foreseeable near future, and households are continuing to face financial challenges. Yoon, Arirang News.
And against these financial challenges, residents here in the country are looking ahead to higher electricity bills this summer, largely owing to surging oil prices. Our Kim Yeon-sung reports.
Newly set electricity prices for the third quarter will be announced this afternoon. Korea Electric Power Corporation, or KEPCO, had earlier suggested raising rates by 33 Korean won, or 3 cents per kilowatt hour in the third quarter. According to KEPCO on Monday, an average household last year used more than 5,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. So a rate hike of that size could really affect people's bills. But KEPCO is saying a rate hike that big is the only way they can get over a financial deficit. With international energy prices rising steeply, KEPCO in the first quarter saw a deficit of more than 7.7 trillion Korean won, or $6 billion US dollars. But a drastic rate hike is unlikely to happen. The South Korean government during the previous administration capped electricity price increases to a maximum 3 Korean won from the previous quarter. So at most, KEPCO can raise electricity rates by 3 won. This comes as inflationary pressure in South Korea grows. Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho had said Monday during a radio show that he foresees prices to grow 6% in June or during the following summer months. Now the government is trying to walk an incredibly thin line between raising energy bills without adding too much pressure on individuals' wallets. Kim Yeon-sung, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of part 1 of the Daily Report. In part 2, we address the ongoing Group of 7 summit in Germany. Stay with us.
South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduced a Korean New Year. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
Protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
Welcome back. On Viewpoint today, we touch upon the ongoing Group of Seven summit in Germany against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its aggravation, that is, of economic challenges worldwide, as well as calls for concrete climate commitment. For more, I have Professor Robert Kelly at Busan National University. Professor Kelly, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
I also have Dr. Miriam Priz-Hansen at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. Dr. Priz-Hansen, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Right, Doctor, you can hear me, right? Doctor, I'm afraid we can't hear you. Can you hear me? Right, and while you turn on your...
Yes, I can hear very well. I'm very
right,
sorry.
There we are. Your volume's up now.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Professor Kelly, let's start with you then. Let's start off, Professor, with a few words on the significance of summits like the G7 in Germany amid the host of current global challenges, if you will.
Sure. So the G7 is something like a coordinating committee, I suppose you might say, of democratic capitalist states, right? It really sort of began during the Cold War as a way to coordinate, roughly speaking, Western economic strategy in the context of the challenge of Soviet communism. And it's kind of grown, I think, again, into this kind of vague, informal coordinating committee. I think there's also the G20, which is a little bit larger, which has sort of become something more important in the last 10 or 20 years as the world economy has sort of spread away from the West. But you still have basically sort of this Western core, right, plus Japan. And that's really what the G7 is. And it often gets overtaken by political events, just as you have pointed out, right? In this case, it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is, the greatest threat to European security, arguably since World War II. And so really that's often the focus, right? And that's what you're seeing now, these security issues.
Right. And Dr. Priz-Hansen, thousands took to the streets, I believe, in Munich this past weekend, demanding less talk and more action by the G7 on climate change. That being said, do you expect any tangible advances on this particular front during the latest G7 gathering, Dr. Priz-Hansen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. First, this is really important that we do not lose track on this. The German government, before the Ukraine invasion, formulated clearly that enhanced climate action is to be the first and foremost priority of its G7 presidency. And the foreign ministers have actually agreed upon some of the important steps regarding decarbonization of energy supply and some more modest suggestions regarding a coal phase out and the phase off of fossil fuels subsidies. In addition, loss and damage was really mentioned for the first time in terms of a traditional, in addition to the traditional commitments to provide more climate finance. I think the most well-discussed idea, and I think we're going to hear much more about this, was the foundation of the so-called climate club, starting with the G7 members, where there was something like a common carbon price, and in addition, there would be protection from competition with something like a carbon border adjustment measures. But I think there's considerable hurdles on this way. So I can go into it a little bit more if you like, but I think that's what we're going to hear a lot about. So my hopes are modest in terms of climate change measures, but I think we will hear a lot about this.
Right, we'll keep our fingers crossed for that, of course. Meanwhile, Professor Kelly, going back to the Ukraine situation, some pundits say the G7 summit may provide German Chancellor Olaf Scholz a chance to capitalize on playing host by adopting perhaps a more assertive leadership regarding the crisis in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would certainly hope so. I think the Ukraine crisis really sort of in the West, I think the Ukraine crisis really should primarily be handled by the Europeans. I mean, it really is on their doorstep, and the United States is getting stuck deeper and deeper into Asia for obvious reasons, right? The rise of China. I think, generally speaking, for Western strategy, it would be good if the United States were to sort of take care of Pacific issues and the Europeans were to take care of European issues. I think it would be great if the Germans would actually sort of push for more integrated European military coordination, not necessarily an army, but at least something. I think it would be great if the Germans spent more on defense so they could actually provide resources more directly to Ukraine. I think the Germans have sort of, quite honestly, not done enough on this in the last 20 years or so. But Germany is the biggest economy in Europe, right? And if we're going to have a European Union with a real defense identity, it's going to require that the Germans make a pretty significant change in the way they have chosen to spend on defense in the last 20 years. And I think this is sort of a really hot debate. I mean, your other guests know better than I would, but my sense is that this is actually a pretty hot debate in Germany right now, and the chancellor is really, sort of on the spot to really make a decision on this. Because, I mean, ultimately, in time, the Americans are going to get pulled away, right? I mean, the Americans are going to get sucked deeper and deeper into Asia because of the China challenge. And the Europeans, I would argue, have to sort of adapt to that at some point. And, Putin, I think, is pushing that along with his invasion.
Right, and staying with that, perhaps that is why, Dr. Pris Hansen, a few observers, especially over there in Germany, France, as well as Italy, have raised the option of ending Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the latter surrendering some territory to the former. Now, in response, countries like the UK, Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have rejected this option, claiming it will only lead to further Russian aggression in the future. Where do you stand on this particular debate?
Obviously, this is a very difficult question, and obviously any way to end this war, to end the human suffering it causes in Ukraine, but also beyond through the food crisis, would be great. However, I think at this point, I do not see the room for peace negotiations. I do not see that Ukraine would be ready to engage in this, and I actually do not see Russia partaking in this in any trustworthy manner as well. So the signals that are coming out of Russia do not point in this direction, I think. And I do not think it's upon anyone outside the Ukraine to tell them to surrender. So anyway, a way needs to be found, but I'm actually quite pessimistic in this regard. So I think for the moment, and probably for the next future, the support to Ukraine needs to continue. And I don't think that there will be anything but this happening at the G7 as well.
Right, and against that backdrop then, Professor Kelly, a recent cross-Europe opinion poll shows that quite a number of people believe tackling the cost of living crisis needs to take priority over efforts to perhaps punish Russia. How does this public sentiment in Europe look to affect its leaders' commitment to supporting Ukraine in the long run?
Yeah, and I would argue that's pretty troublesome, right? I mean, ultimately, I would argue that what's happening in Ukraine is significantly more important to all of us, not just in Europe, but all of us really, than things like inflation or the cost of gasoline. I mean, it's important to remember just what exactly the Russians are doing in Ukraine, right? I mean, they're operating something like death squads behind the lines, where they're sort of handcuffing people and shooting them. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. I mean, Russia is sort of becoming a sort of quasi-fascist state engaging in pretty severe war crimes. And I'm kind of shocked that all of us in the democratic world are saying, well, we should sort of push Ukraine towards concessions because gas prices are high. I mean, that just sort of strikes me as sort of like morally just sort of grotesque. And I'm hoping so far Europe's elites have, I think, really sort of held the line on this, as I think has President Biden back in the United States. But I think we need to get our priorities straight here. I mean, I'm just looking at the footage you're running right now of Ukraine. I mean, that's what's happening to these people. And we're talking about, whether or not we're going to pay an extra 20% for gasoline. I mean, I just don't understand that, the measure of those two things. I mean, Russia has become a genuine threat to European security and to human security in Europe, right? Particularly, again, with its war crimes behavior. And to me, the case for supporting Ukraine, even if there are financial costs and economic costs elsewhere, is actually pretty strong.
Right, to say the least, of course. And briefly speaking, Dr. Pris Hansen, what can you share with us about the German public's sentiment with regard to the government's ongoing support of Ukraine against Russia?
Yes, there was recently a big opinion poll by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which shows quite clearly that in comparison to states such as Italy, the German public is still quite hawkish, but I think support is actually unfortunately going down. So if we look at some of the numbers, so most Germans still mainly blame Russia for the war, and they differ over. They don't differ about who represents the biggest threat in this. So, and 63% in Germany believe the answer to this question, who's to blame, is Russia. But only 39% of Italians agree. So I think we will see going across countries the support to go down. I do think, however, in Germany, most people at this point support, for example, more than 50%, for example, support the sending of additional arms and military supplies to the Ukrainian government. Also, that additional troops should be sent to NATO, Eastern NATO members. And what probably makes the most difference in the long run, Germans back increasing defense spending. I mean, this has been the biggest issue in the German debate about this as well. And about 50% still increase this defense, support the increase of defense spending, which is an enormous shift to previous public opinion. So I think that cannot be underestimated in this regard.
Right, I see. And Dr. Pris Hansen, just ahead of the G7 summit, leaders of the 5 major emerging economies, that would be Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, gathered virtually for the 2022 BRICS summit chaired by Beijing last week. Now, a key agenda was the possible expansion of this gathering to include more members. Which countries do you suppose are on the list, and how does this expansion perhaps look to affect international order, so to speak?
Yeah, thank you for this question, which is actually a very interesting one, as it illustrates some of the central dynamics within BRICS in general. So China is the clearest and biggest proponent of BRICS expansion. And among the more credible candidates are clearly Indonesia, Argentina, other guests to the so-called BRICS Plus format this year were Egypt, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, and a few others. But as said, this seems to be mainly a China agenda. And India, for example, is incredibly wary of any expansion of Chinese influence or even domination within BRICS. So what happened regarding the expansion at this year's summits is actually quite telling. So China, as the host, had the clear intention to bring BRICS expansion on the way. India opposed this. And if we look at the final document, the Beijing Summit Declaration, we can see how India and possibly also some of the other BRICS refused to grant this wish to China. Instead, somewhere towards the end of the document, it said that BRICS supports further debate on BRICS expansion, but only if frameworks, rules, procedures, I'm paraphrasing here, are clarified. So this sounded to me like a loud and clear diplomatic no to me. So I don't think we will see this happening at any point soon.
Right, I see. Professor Keller, the G7 summit this year has invited Senegal, Argentina, Indonesia, India and South Africa. The last 2 guests, of course, are members of BRICS. What can you tell us about this year's list of invitees and perhaps the G7's intentions?
Sure. So I think the G7 has come under a fair amount of criticism in the last couple of decades since the end of the Cold War and through the rise of neoliberalism, if you will. The G7 has come under a lot of criticism that it doesn't do enough for the global developing world, particularly for the global south, for the developing world. All right, and I think it's been sort of sensitive to that point and has made efforts to sort of pull in those states. I think the G7 has pushed the IMF, for example, to be a little bit more lenient on things like conditionality on loans to poor countries. I also think there's concern about maintaining some kind of durable anti-Russian coalition that extends beyond the West and a few token countries in Asia like Japan and South Korea, right? I mean, there is sort of a concern out there that this thing, that the Ukraine conflict is really turning into this kind of proxy war between the West and Russia, you know, with Japan and South Korea, again, sort of on the side, and the rest of the global South is kind of hedging. And I think that's what's happening. And so I think that's part of what this is, right? This is an effort to see if we can sort of pull some of these states in, right? Sort of convince sort of countries out there outside of the West that, look, the Russian behavior, sort of like chewing up countries and sort of pulling off bits and pieces of them, represents a threat to you too, right? You wouldn't want the Chinese to do this to you, for example, right? And so I think that's what you're seeing here, right? You're seeing an effort to kind of widen this anti-Russian coalition, particularly because the war is probably going to drag on, right? The war's not going to end soon, right? Even if we try to push the Ukrainians to give up, they're not going to do it. Like Kissinger said, they're not going to do it, right? And so this thing is going to probably drag on for a while. Even if the Russians win, it's going to turn into Afghanistan. It's going to become a big sort of partisan thing. You know, you're going to have sort of like a rebel movement. It's going to turn into like Vietnam or Afghanistan or something like that. It's going to drag on for 4 or 5 years, right? And so I think Western leaders are starting to grasp that and are starting to look to widen the coalition for something that's going to go on for a while.
Right. Meanwhile, Dr. Pris Hansen, aside from the conflict in Ukraine and climate change, G7 leaders are also looking to carefully craft global economic responses as the United Nations has warned of an unprecedented global hunger crisis. Now, some believe that the problem has little to do with production and more to do with the distribution of food. And that being said, what efforts might serve to perhaps ease global hunger?
Yeah, thanks. Again, this is a crisis which absolutely cannot be ignored and for which the G7 can and has to take on responsibility and bring measures on the way, both for the respective national agendas, but also in preparation of the G20 and other multilateral meetings. Among the first things regarding food security is obviously finding ways to get grain and wheat out of Ukraine. So I'm sure we will hear something about that. But issues, as you say in your question, are more structural beyond the Ukraine crisis. Even so, in the May meeting at the G7 agricultural ministers, the key topic was the transformation of food systems, which speaks to the issue that it's not production alone that's causing the problem, but the system, the overall organization as such. Second topic, also telling, was sustainable supply chains. Again, speaking to the issue of distribution. One of the key things that can be done in this regard is the strengthening of production in the global south. And one of the other sort of part of that may be a more trickier aspect regarding at the G7, also in light of the outreach guests that were just mentioned, including India, maybe that the G7 announce and strive to, and I quote here, to avoid signals and undue measures that restrict exports and lead to further increases in food input prices. This is in light of Indians' export ban on wheat. So I'm curious, and I hope that a solution will be found. And I think we're going to hear more about that, particularly in light of the Ukraine crisis. There was, for example, the announcement of a global alliance on food security. That's what was suggested both at the agricultural and development ministers' meetings in May, in order to help also in the crisis as such, so the most devastating consequences for the most vulnerable right now, but also to support development agencies and other agencies in this area to find more sustainable ways of doing things in the future.
Right. And back on the political front, and Professor Kelly, Ukraine and Moldova were recently granted EU candidate status. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin, that is, has insisted he has nothing against Ukraine joining the EU, but Kremlin claims it will give the application increased attention because the EU is considering its own defense force. Now, does this status look to affect tensions between Kyiv and Moscow, do you think?
Yeah, I think that EU status, EU membership is actually a decent peace possibility for the Ukraine conflict, right? The Ukrainians pretty clearly want Western integration or some measure of Western integration at this point, right? The Russians don't, right? Particularly, they're very concerned about security integration, which is to say NATO, right? And so I think that one way to sort of split the difference would be to say, okay, the Ukrainians don't get into NATO. I mean, nobody really believes it's going to happen anyway. But we will let the Ukrainians get into the European Union. This would allow the Ukrainians to export more substantially, right, with sort of less transaction costs to Western Europe, particularly to Germany, I might add, right? And that would be sort of like a decent halfway house, right? I have the feeling whenever this thing actually sort of rolls into negotiations, probably sometime before the end of the year, this is actually going to be one of the things that people agree on, right? No NATO, but you do get the European Union. And the European Union could also provide a lot of the reconstruction assistance that's going to be necessary in Ukraine, which the Russians aren't going to want to give. I mean, we're not really talking about that. That's sort of like 5 or 6 steps down the road at this point, right? But it's going to require a lot of money to put Ukraine back on its feet. And, the Russians are not going to want to pay for that. They're just not going to want to do it. And the European Union would be an alternative for that. So I actually like the idea of European candidate status for Ukraine. I mean, I think it gives us something of this off-ramp we've heard so much about. But again, as your other guest mentioned, and Putin just doesn't sound like he's very interested in this, right? I mean, it really looks like he's going to try to win or at least pound Ukraine into the ground in the next few months to reduce it substantially. So I think the value of European membership, EU membership, is maybe 6 months or 12 months away when we get to negotiations. But again, I think it provides a sort of halfway. It's like a half kind of solution, right? You don't get NATO, but you get the EU. That's not bad. That's a decent compromise, I think.
Right, a decent compromise right there. All right, Professor Keller, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks,
and Dr. Pris Hansen over in Germany, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
In sports news, South Korean golfer Chun In-gee is bringing home her third major championship. Our Ji-young covers the hard-fought game.
South Korean golf player Chun In-gee has won a major women's PGA championship for the third time. At the Congressional Country Club's Blue Course in Bethesda, Maryland on Sunday local time, Chun took first place at the KPMG Women's PGA Championship. Finishing on a 5 under 283, Chun, a 27-year-old from South Korea, held off Lexi Thompson of the United States and Minji Lee of Australia by one shot. Chun overcame a bogey-filled front nine and closed her victory by taking a 3-stroke lead into the final round with a 3/75. She was leading by 6 shots at the tournament's halfway point, but stumbled to a 75 in the third round and lost her 3-shot advantage after just 3 holes in the final round. Chun regained her lead on the 17th and won her third championship with a clutch par putt on the final hole. Winning her first major at the U.S. Women's Open in 2015, she has held the Champions Trophy with 4 LPGA wins, with 3 of them coming at majors. It's her first tour victory since October 2018, ending South Korea's title drought in big tournaments after 7 attempts. Ji-young, Arirang News.
Many countries in the Northern Hemisphere are fighting unusually early heat waves that are threatening public health and well-being. Arirang has more on this alarming phenomenon, which experts are linking to climate change.
This weekend has been a scorcher in parts of Europe, the U.S., and Asia. In Spain and France, it got above 40 degrees Celsius. In the United States, more than 20 million people were under heat alerts in 16 states. Northern and central China got into the 40s as well, with the authorities advising people to avoid activities outdoors. Heavy rains caused flooding in China's south, disrupting the lives of nearly 500,000 people. The south of China has seen its worst flooding in decades, with Guangdong province on Tuesday raising its alert to the highest level after days of rainfall. In Japan on Saturday, more than 60 regions, including Tokyo, saw temperatures higher than 35 degrees. According to Yomiuri Shinbun, this is the earliest in the summer for it to get that hot in Tokyo since data were first compiled in 1875. The Korean capital of Seoul on Sunday recorded its highest overnight low in 25 years. It never got below 24.6 degrees. In the city Incheon, the overnight low was the highest in 117 years. Decades-long records broken in other cities too. Heat waves are a phenomenon that's been occurring more frequently in recent years around the world, as shown by a study by the American Meteorological Society. The average number of days between May and September with at least one large heat wave in the Northern Hemisphere has doubled from 73 in the 1980s to 152 in the 2010s. And the number of days with 2 or more heat waves in different parts of the hemisphere was 7 times higher. Some scientists say more extreme weather events will accompany these heat waves. They say a slowdown of air currents can cause heat waves to last longer as temperature differences narrow, keeping weather systems from moving around the planet. They warn global warming could lead to disease, death, and poor harvests, which could aggravate global food shortages. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, here in Seoul, the Riverside swimming pools at Hangang parks are open again after a 2-year closure owing to pandemic-related restrictions. My colleague Chun In-gee was there.
The summer monsoon has officially begun, which for some brings welcome relief from the stifling heat.
Apart from enjoying the rain, there's another perfect way for people to cool off in Seoul, swimming on the banks of the Hangang River.
These riverside pools have reopened for the first time in 3 years after being closed due to the pandemic.
We had to close the swimming pools for the past 2 years because of COVID-19. We decided to reopen them after social distancing rules were eased.
Splash pools are now open at Hangang parks in Nanji and Yanghwa, and swimming pools are open in Yeouido, Jamwon, Tuksum, and Gwangnaru. They are not only cool summer getaways in the city, but also very affordable ones. Adults can enjoy the pool for around the price of a coffee at just 5,000 won, which is less than $4. And it costs even less for children and those wishing to visit splash pools.
We're feeling great. Compared to water parks, it's cheaper and much closer to my house. I want to come every week.
It's cheap and we can eat freely outside. It feels like we are out on a picnic.
Although mask wearing is not a must for people when outdoors, they are strongly advised to wear them, especially when areas get crowded. And people should remember that masks have to be put back on when they're going inside to buy snacks or change their clothes. These Riverside attractions are open every day from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. until mid-August. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
On the medical front, researchers here have found a way to streamline the treatment of liver cancer. Our Chung In-gee explains the procedure.
A microscopic wire called a catheter is inserted into a blood vessel. When a substance that can block blood vessels is put into the catheter, the flow of blood and supply of nutrients is cut off. This technique is called embolization and is used to prevent the growth of tumors. When treating cancer, a chemotherapy drug is sometimes injected into blood vessels before they are blocked. But the problem with embolization is that it may be difficult to insert chemotherapy drugs or embolic agents into the veins if they're very small. There's also the risk of the drugs flowing backwards. A South Korean research team has suggested solving this problem by implementing something called medical microrobotic technology. First, anti-cancer drugs are attached to magnetic nanoparticles before being injected into blood vessels. Then, a magnetic field is applied, making it possible to steer and control the nanoparticles precisely in the direction of the tumor. Using a magnetic field to fix embolic agents in place also decreases the risk of backflow.
The technology targets the liver wall precisely by using embolic agents supplied, an electromagnetic field device that can move those agents, and navigation information from X-rays.
The researchers' primary goal is to develop hepatic artery chemoembolization to treat liver cancer. It is currently the most widely used technique to treat liver cancer and is expected to reach a global market of $2.4 billion by 2026.
Our goal is to significantly increase efficiency by implementing advanced technology such as medical microrobots on existing procedures.
The same researchers claim to have demonstrated the technology's feasibility by carrying out experiments on animals. They plan to develop a prototype that can be used on humans over the next 5 years and then verify its safety and effectiveness through actual clinical practice for another 2 years. Chung In-gee, Arirang News.
Last Tuesday, South Korea joined the world's most exclusive club by becoming the 7th country to have built a launch vehicle capable of carrying and placing satellites weighing over a ton into space. Well, my colleagues Kim Do-yeon and Han Sung-wook, who covered the event, have also shared a video log of their coverage. To take a look.
All right, this is going to be your first rocket launch. How are you feeling?
Very excited, a bit nervous actually. We're gonna be on site for a historic launch, right? The second launch of Nuri. It's something I've only seen in the movies, Tom Hanks, Apollo 13, but to actually be there, what an exciting experience it'll be.
All right, let's go.
All right.
Despite all this excitement, about an hour into the drive south, we got some news. The Korea Aerospace Research Institute decided to push back the launch by 24 hours due to the weather, just minutes before Arirang TV's first newscast of the day, and we had to stop at a rest point to break the story.
The scheduled second launch of the Nuri space rocket, which was set to take place on Wednesday, has been delayed to Thursday.
That's right. Today's weather forecast posed obstacles to the transportation of the rocket. And once it's erected, the screening of umbilical cords and connecting the cables could have been dangerous for the engineers.
Nuri stands almost 50 meters tall, and the engineers will be working from the umbilical tower exposed to potential risks. The cables mentioned would be crucial in connecting the rocket to the control room. The umbilical cords would provide the fuel and oxidizers needed for the launch. The engineers also assure the public that there are no problems with the rocket itself, and it showed, as after the 24-hour delay, all steps seemed to be on course.
Addressing the press at the time, officials cautiously concluded they feel good about Nuri's chances for Thursday, with the weather forecast also in the rocket's favor.
We think it's highly likely the launch will be a success. Then again, there's no guarantee that unexpected variables won't pop up last minute, so we're not letting down our guard.
All right, 1 day left. Tomorrow, Nuri will be going on its second launch. And now, today, what it'll be doing is it'll be moved, transported to the launch pad through a transporter vehicle. That'll happen at 7:20 a.m. That's what we're going to cover today. The weather's looking a bit foggy. It's not raining, though, and it's not windy either. And yesterday, the Korea Aerospace Research Institute did say that they feel good about the weather moving forward. So I'm looking forward to seeing it being moved to the launch pad. And that's where all the umbilical cables, electrical cables will be connected. And 1 day left, people. So tomorrow at around 4 p.m., the exact time is yet to be decided, but that's when Nuri will be soaring into the skies and sending actual satellites into orbit, hopefully if it succeeds on its mission.
And the transportation process went smoothly, with hardly any wind. The sun shining bright and Nuri standing fully upright on its launch pad by around 11 a.m. Wednesday. Then, another sudden announcement a day before liftoff. A technical glitch detected at around 2 p.m. in the oxidizer level sensor in the rocket's first stage meant Nuri had to be transported from the launch pad back to where it was assembled.
After trying to figure out the issue at the launch pad, we realized it was not possible to get up close and analyze the problem while it's standing up. That's why we decided it's impossible to carry out the launch at the moment.
Too bad Nuri can't be launched on Thursday.
Yeah, look on the bright side though. What a relief the issue was detected. We can always come back for the coverage when the rocket is in tip-top shape.
True. I mean, it's not a failed launch. The cancellation itself just shows how many checks there are.
Yeah, we'll just have to see when the next launch date is, and hopefully it happens soon, and we'll be back for it.
Well, I guess that wraps up our on-site coverage for now then.
That's right. Let's pack up and get back home.
But just when it seemed as though it would be postponed for several weeks, Nuri's launch was suddenly back on.
At first, we thought Nuri's first and second stages would have to be separated to replace the problematic sensor itself, but researchers at the Korea Aerospace Research Institute, after close examination, found the issue could be solved by replacing just one key part that was malfunctioning.
Replacing the sensor's core and not the sensor itself was enough to do the job, removing the need for them to disassemble the rocket and allowing the country to launch Nuri within its alternative launch window, ending June 23rd.
Well, Song, it's great to hear that everything's going to plan thus far. No one wants to see another delay, least of all you, I'd imagine, because you've been up and down between there and Seoul for the past number of days. But what exactly is the plan between right now and the launch that's due to happen in around 4 hours from now?
Well, beginning around 4 hours before the launch, that's about right now, assuming no irregularities arise during last-minute inspections, the fuel and oxidizer charging process will begin, after which the erector keeping Nuri stable on its launch pad will be removed.
And so it happened. One more trip to the launch pad, fuel injection, pre-launch operation, and finally 3, 2, 1, liftoff. With the roar, the ground shook before Nuri, powered by 4 first-stage 75-ton liquid fuel engines, blasted into space.
Now, Sung-woo, what a sight that was. I mean, Nuri blasting off into space. I imagine the NATO Space Center was in high spirits and currently is in high spirits right now.
The 3-stage space rocket, after reaching its target altitude of 700 kilometers, placed both its performance verification satellite, holding 4 functioning mini-cube satellites, and its 1.3-ton dummy satellite into orbit, 70 seconds apart at around 4:15 p.m.
Claps of joy ensued, and an hour later, the Korea Aerospace Research Institute and the Ministry of Science and ICT held a joint presser on site, declaring mission accomplished.
Nuri reached its target altitude and successfully placed the performance satellite into orbit.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol watched the event from his office in Yongsan-gu District, Seoul. He called it a product of 30 years of effort and promised more support for the country's space program.
정부도 제가 공약에서 말씀드린 바와 같이 항공우주청을 설치해서 이 항공우주 산업을 체계적으로 지원하겠습니다. 고맙습니다. 정말 수고 많으셨습니다.
With 4 more launches scheduled by 2027, our crew left NATO Space Center the following morning, knowing that though the Nuri project is far from over, South Korea's space endeavors have only just begun.
From the NATO Space Center in Gohung, Jeollanam-do Province,
that was Kim Do-yeon,
Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Protests continued over the weekend across the US following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the constitutional right to have an abortion. The ruling was made in a 6-3 conservative majority vote and will likely see more than half of the US states implement or consider a ban on abortion. Speaking in the wake of the ruling on Sunday, leading Democratic women Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called on President Joe Biden and Congress to protect abortion rights by using federal land as a safe haven for those who wish to have an abortion. The measure could be used in states that ban or severely restrict the practice. Going further, Senator Warren added that the Supreme Court has lost its legitimacy and needs more justices.
I believe we need to get some confidence back in our court, and that means we need more justices on the United States Supreme Court.
Meanwhile, celebrities have had their say on the landmark decision, with Marvel star Chris Hemsworth saying it is a massive step backwards, while singers Olivia Rodrigo and Lily Allen performed a song at the Glastonbury Music Festival in response to the ruling. 22 young adults have been found dead at a nightclub in South Africa in the southeastern town of East London. Local authorities said residents reported finding the bodies on Sunday morning at Enyobeni Tavern in Scenery Park following end of school year celebrations. The cause of the deaths is still under investigation, with experts carrying out toxicology tests to see if the victims were poisoned, as they carried no visible wounds. Speaking during his trip to the G7 summit, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa voiced his condolences over the incident. The weekend saw annual Pride parades take place across the world, from Mexico City to Paris and Toronto. But Pride celebration planned in Turkey's Istanbul came to a halt as authorities blocked hundreds of people from gathering for the city parade on Sunday, while dozens more were arrested. This comes after local officials banned the march again this year in light of a toughened stance on LGBTQ freedoms by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Meanwhile, a deadly shooting took place in the early hours of Saturday in and nearby a gay bar in the Norwegian capital, Oslo. The incident came just ahead of the city's annual Pride Festival and is being investigated as a terrorist attack. 2 people were killed and 21 wounded in the shooting not long before the start of the Oslo Pride Parade. Police in Norway say they're investigating it as a terrorist incident because of the number of dead and injured. The suspect is a Norwegian citizen of Iranian descent who was caught at the scene. The Pride Parade was officially cancelled, but hundreds of people demonstrated near the scene later in the day. As many football leagues take their summer break, Poland is offering avid football fans another kind of tournament, the Swampians League. The event, named after the Champions League, took place over 2 days on Saturday and Sunday. Poland's northeast city of Korysin hosted the teams from Poland and Ukraine for the annual muddy competition. Now, in its 6th year, the event saw 6 women's and 22 men's teams take part. The event's organizers said the contest can help people decompress and shows that even in dark times, life can be normal. Swamp football's origins are believed to come from Finland as a way to improve the stamina of soldiers as well as athletes. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon, I'm Lee Ji-hyun, filling in for Choi Ji-hyun this afternoon. The monsoon makes its return, getting ready to drop rain across Korea. And the further north you are, the heavier the rainfall you're going to get through tomorrow, with up to 150 millimeters of rain in the forecast in north-central regions. But not only has the monsoon season come early this year, but also many regions had the season's first tropical nights over the weekend, and Seoul had the warmest June night in 25 years last night. But highs will not go up too high today, but the high humidity will make it feel very uncomfortable. In fact, the risk of food poisoning is at its highest level across Korea, so please be mindful of food safety and remember to clean, separate, cook, and chill your food. Well, the monsoon front stays with us through the week, so please keep an umbrella handy. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And those are the top stories for this Monday afternoon. Do stay tuned to Arirang News for more of the day's headlines. Thank you for now.